You may know about Konami's second company, Outtro Games. This was their way of releasing more games without breaking Nintendo's rules. You may not know, however, that Konami also tried this same tactic in Europe, but they would make some very interesting decisions with this new branding. Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Podrez coming at you with another video. Alright, if you've seen a couple of my videos and you like what I do, hit that subscribe button right there. And check out our Discord server, discord.podrez.net. I'll also put a link right in the description. Anyway, let's talk about PALCOM. Nintendo wanted to release their new console in the US, but they couldn't just release it as is like they did in Japan. The US was going through a video game crash that was caused by the poor reputation of game consoles at the time. The Atari 2600 had a ton of bad games on their console, and there was no quality assurance back then to filter these out. There were also bad consoles that were flooding the market. Consumers had no way of knowing what consoles and games were good and which ones were not, so as a result, they lost interest entirely. Nintendo had a plan of getting around this. Notice the unusual shape of the NES. It looks more like a VCR than a game console, and that's exactly what they were going for. The cartridges looked more like videotapes, and the early units even came with Rob the Robot, which was more of a toy than a video game accessory. By marketing the NES as a toy rather than a video game console, they might be able to win over consumers. Not only did the plan work, but the games were actually good. Super Mario Bros. Really showed what the NES could do. Mario looks exactly like he did in the arcades. You also get way more content than you ever did on any game on a previous console. The levels are massive and there's multiple stages that you can play. Atari games were usually only 1 or 2 screens and the graphics were very simplistic in comparison. Nintendo was on the right track, but if they wanted to keep that positive momentum, they needed to be more strict with their policies. Nintendo had a licensing policy where every game had to be approved by them first. You couldn't just make a game and release it without Nintendo's permission. In fact, Nintendo placed some very harsh restrictions on their licensees. You were only allowed to make a certain amount of games per year. You also had to sign an exclusivity agreement which prevented you from making games for the competitors. Some companies didn't like Nintendo's rules, but had no choice but to agree. The NES was the best-selling console at the time, and the competitors were way behind. It made more sense to agree to Nintendo's harsh policies. With how successful the launch was in the US, Nintendo would release the NES in Europe as well, but they would handle it differently. Unlike the US, where Nintendo handled everything, the NES would be distributed by different companies within European territories. However, Nintendo would still handle manufacturing and would also keep many of the strict policies from the US. Companies were restricted on how many games they could make per year. The yearly limit forced companies to pick and choose what games were worth bringing over from Japan and which ones were not. One company that suffered greatly from this was Konami. They had a huge library of Japanese games that they wanted to localize, but the yearly limit made that difficult. Konami had a plan for the US though. They created the company Outtro Games, which essentially doubled the amount of games they could make per year. All the games under the Outtro branding still had that Konami feel. After all, it was just a name change. Konami would use the same tactic in Europe, this time under the name PALCOM. This way, Konami could more easily bring their games over from Japan. But here's an interesting question. What games do you label under Konami and which ones do you label under PALCOM? Do you save the good games for the priority branding and give the mediocre ones the lesser branding? With Outtro Games, it seemed like the main franchises like Contra and Castlevania were under Konami, while the licensed games like Ninja Turtles were under Outtro Games. But they were not consistent with this. Operation C, which is a game under the Contra series, was given the Outtro Games label for an unknown reason. There were 2 PALCOM games that did not receive a US release, Road Fighter and Parodius. There were also a couple games that received the Konami branding in the US but got the PALCOM one in Europe. We're going to take a look at a few PALCOM games and discuss why they may have received that branding. Here's Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. For those who don't know, the series was renamed to Hero Turtles in Europe because the word ninja was considered too violent. You start off in an overworld and you can walk into buildings and tunnels where you play a platformer segment. You can switch between turtles on the fly, which is a nice feature. The controls are excellent. You're able to aim in multiple directions, which is extremely convenient. The game can be very trolly at times. There's a lot of tight jumps you have to make, and if you miss, you have to redo that entire segment over again. This is bad because all the enemies reappear after you destroy them. What makes this game so difficult is that your life bar doesn't get refilled in between stages. But regardless, this game is commonly considered to be one of the best on the NES, but in the last 15 years, it has received some hate from angry reviewers. I do think this is an excellent game despite some of the trolly aspects. Konami most likely gave this game the PALCOM branding because it was a licensed title and therefore doesn't need the extra boost. But in a strange move, the second game would receive the Konami label. It's unclear why they made this decision when the US version did not. Let's take a look at Castlevania III. You start off as Trevor Belmont and it's a platformer where you must follow the path to the end. There's various weapon upgrades you can collect as Trevor. Along the way, you can unlock other playable characters that have different abilities. For example, Alucard can turn into a bat at the cost of hearts, but his power output is weak. Against bosses, he's terrible, but Alucard is excellent at platforming. The fact that you can play as multiple characters gives this game a lot of replayability. This is an excellent game and one of my favorites in the Castlevania franchise. It's very surprising that they used the PALCOM branding here. It's one of Konami's main franchises, so it strikes me as odd that they did this. Now for Parodius. This is one of the games that was not released in the US. It's a cute-em-up that has a unique upgrade system. You collect items that advance the cursor at the bottom. When you have the weapon you want, you can purchase it. Unlike Gradius, the game contains elements from many of Konami's franchises. You can play as different characters, each of which have a different set of weapons. The graphics are very bright and colorful, unlike what you typically see in Gradius. In the later stages, you see shooting stars in the background, which gives the illusion of parallax scrolling. It's a nice touch. My biggest problem with this game is the slowdown. There's a lot of animation and sprites flying across the screen, and it causes a lot of slowdown. I'm not completely sure why it's so slow because Gradius 2 was very fast-paced. There may have been a lot of flicker in that game, but there was no slowdowns. I'm not sure why they couldn't emulate this in Parodius. I also really hate the roulette item. This will randomly select an item from the bottom. However, some items are bad and will mess you up. I'm not sure why they thought this was a good feature. This is a great game, but I do like Gradius 2 better. It's unclear why Konami chose the PALCOM branding for this game. They may not have had very high expectations and figured that the Konami name would be better used elsewhere. Here's Bucky O'Hare. This is one of the last games released on the NES. You start off as Bucky O'Hare, obviously, and you must save your friends from captivity. At the beginning, you can select what stage you start off on. It's a platformer where you must walk to the right and win. You can play as multiple different characters, each of which have a different ability. Bucky himself can super jump while Blinky has a rocket. The game has both vertical and horizontal scrolling segments. There's a lot of cool effects they pulled off in this game. One stage has fake parallax scrolling that looks very convincing. The game is extremely difficult. In one segment, you have to migrate down while lava spills across the level. If you touch the lava, it's an automatic death. Your precision has to be almost task-like to make it past this part. Thankfully, your life bar is very generous. Not only do you have unlimited continues, but you start right where you left off, not at the beginning like most games. This is a phenomenal title. I'm very glad this got a European and US release. It's a little strange that this game received the PALCOM branding when the US version was Konami. Nintendo had already relaxed their policies in the US, so Konami didn't need the Ultra Games branding at that point. I wasn't able to find any information on this, but I have reason to believe that Nintendo continued the yearly limit in Europe for longer. Here's Probotector on the Game Boy. For those who don't know, when Contra was released in Europe, the theme had to be changed to robots in order to make it less violent. So while the US and Japan were getting Contra games, Europe was getting Probotector games. This particular title happens to be Europe's version of Operation C. It's a shoot-em-up where you can obtain weapon upgrades. This is basically a watered-down version of the NES Contra games. Most of the levels are borrowed from those games, and even the music was reused. There's only 3 weapons in this game, not counting the default one. The spread gun is here, but you have to collect it twice in order for it to be fully powered up. Surprisingly, there's a homing gun which shoots 3 bullets at a time. This is my favorite weapon by far. This game doesn't offer much that the NES ones didn't already do, but I cut it some slack because it's a Game Boy title. It's odd that Konami used the PALCOM branding for this game when the NES Probotector games did not. They did the same thing with Operation C in the US. Unlike Outtro games, it's more unclear why they chose the games that they did to use the PALCOM branding. Some of the main franchises like Castlevania and Probotector did receive the lesser branding. They were not consistent at all with what games received which label. Outtro games was a little more consistent, although there were still some odd choices here and there. For all we know, they may not have had a process at all. They may have just used the PALCOM label when they ran out of their allotment of Konami ones. Like I mentioned when talking about Bucky O'Hare, the PALCOM brand lasted a bit longer than Outtro games. The latter company was dropped in 1992 when Nintendo relaxed their policies in the US, but PALCOM lasted until 1994, even showing up in games that were released on the Super Nintendo. I wasn't able to find any information on when Nintendo relaxed their yearly game limit in Europe or why Konami kept the brand for so long. Similar to the US, Nintendo didn't bother going after Konami for creating PALCOM despite it being a way to bypass the yearly limit. It's not against the rules to create a second company, and if Konami wants to go through the trouble of doing so, why not just let them? Konami was also not abusing their ability to make more games. It just so happens that they were bringing over some excellent titles. Not even Nintendo is going to be that petty. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.